You know how to do this, and in general we use nouns and rather than pronouns, or we say name the project and then go into it rather than, it was or something like that. I'll go slow to make sure you feel comfortable.
All right, beautiful.
Okay. So please state your name and the name of your organization.
Carol Zoe, Asian Arts Initiative.
Briefly tell me how and when you came to the National Performance Network, as well as your organization.
So I have been with Asian Arts Initiative since 2017, and when I joined the staff, Asian Arts Initiative had already been engaged with NPN for several years. So I remember, for example, hearing about presenting Los Angeles Poverty Department What Fuels Development through an NPN presenting grant. As I've worked at Asian Arts Initiative, I've also overseen several projects that we were able to present through the Audience Engagement Fund. I can never remember what it's called. And so personally, as someone who's been working in community arts for about a decade, I primarily work in visual and public art, not so much in the performing arts, but I consider myself like performing arts adjacent. And so I had always heard about NPN in my community and definitely with my friends who were theater practitioners.
Why don't we go right to the project and then come back to sort of some of the impact and influence questions too. And the one that seems most relevant is, and this is speaking in terms of the Social Practice Lab, which I think is like a big creative placemaking component of Asian Arts Initiative. Is that correct?
Yes.
I would say, how have you leveraged art, culture, creativity to impact quality of life in your neighborhood? If we could talk about that. And you feel free to offer examples from the cohorts that have been through the practice lab. Is that?
Yeah, that sounds good. So our program, Social Practice Lab, grew out of, I think, this need to more deeply train artists in how to work with community, to think through some of the ethical considerations, and to really have the support of an institution, an artist fee, a project budget, community partnerships that were being facilitated by the institution, as well as access to a cohort of artists and advisors. And so our first Social Practice Lab iteration convened national advisors as well as a local cohort of practicing artists. And the local cohort had access to these national advisors, and they also had access to local resource teams that were consisting of community organizations like the Chinatown Learning Center, or I think Holy Redeemer, a local church, was also part of it, so that they could really consult and build these collaborations with community institutions. And so something that we've found is to be successful, we need to maintain these community relationships over time. And so this became a multi-year residency project. And so, for example, we have collaborated with Sunday Breakfast Rescue Mission, which is a local homeless shelter, on multiple cohorts of Social Practice Lab projects. And that helps us connect to our neighborhood, as well as train artists and educate them in a way of thinking about their practices outside of the studio.
Are you comfortable remembering some of the artists their work who've come through the practice lab?
I do not remember who was funded by NPN.
It'd be okay to talk. This is more broadly about the creative placemaking projects, or the creative placemaking among the partners within the network. So, it's more broad. I mean, we're researching.
Yeah, for sure.
Looking at the sort of the relationship of our own community engagement to what becomes creative placemaking. So.
Yeah, so artists that we've supported through Social Practice Lab include Dave Q, who did a local skywriting project, and he actually solicited phrases from local neighborhood organizations like the Folk Arts and Cultural Treasures School to do an afternoon of skywritten messages in the neighborhood. Another more recent artist is Yvonne Lung, and she did a project called Dish, and it was looking at recipes as a form of passing on intergenerational knowledge and making sure that that type of knowledge could be captured. A recent artist in residence, Rachel Ishikawa, also did a project called Chinatown Beats. So she worked with a sound engineer to create an interface where you could remix field recordings. And then she worked with our youth arts workshop to go out into the community and gather field recordings and then remix them. And then the person with the best remix received a prize. And so it's this idea of doing listening or like deep listening in your neighborhood, but listening in creative ways.
Is there a way to capture or express sort of the arc of the process that the artist does? I mean, when is the first consultation with the organization, the first meeting with the community, so that I could get a sense of the nature of that sort of extended residency within community? Is there a general, like guidelines that you follow at Asian Arts Initiative?
So not all of the artists that apply for our social practice lab are familiar with our neighborhood. And in fact, we just released a publication, What We Want Is Here. And we ask the artists to provide advice that they would have for their younger selves, looking back on these projects, right? And I think something really salient that emerged out of those artist testimonies is this idea that one needs to be open to change and one needs to be open to feedback. And I would say we definitely saw that type of growth in the development of artist projects. And so, of course, in order for us to accept a project or accept a proposal, an application, the artist needs to propose something, right? The artist needs to have at least some framework or some description of a project in mind when they answer our call. But as we work with the artists, their projects can evolve drastically depending on the relationships that they form within the neighborhood. So we are usually the ones who have these relationships with community partners who can kind of recommend people for them to work with. And as they start to have those conversations over about the course of a year, their project usually transforms in some way from what was originally proposed or intended. Yeah.
Thank you. Tell me about what have been some of the biggest victories, and what have been some of the challenges you experienced, and what have you learned? This was a big one, but
when it comes to community engagement?
Yeah, community engagement and in the sort of the creative placemaking mode. And
right. Well, so I think I'll name two victories, and then I think the second one kind of leads into a challenge too. So I think one victory is definitely providing this incubator moment for artists to really explore a project or even explore a way of working that maybe they haven't thought about before, and to really receive the resources and the institutional support to do that. And I would say that we have seen graduates or alums from our social practice lab go on to have really amazing and fruitful careers in public art and socially engaged art. And so, for example, Yvonne Lung and Dave Q, who were two of our social practice lab residents, but in different years. And Dave was actually the project manager on staff when Yvonne was in residence. They both recently received a grant from the Velocity Fund, which is administered by Temple Contemporary, but it's a fund of the Andy Warhol Fund for the Arts. They just recently received an award to continue developing Yvonne's dish project in meal kit form. So that for me is one victory. Another concrete victory is to see these relationships and projects develop and last beyond the scope of the residency. And so Mei Ling Ng is an urban farmer who created an urban farm in collaboration with Sunday Breakfast Rescue Mission, a local homeless shelter. And so she is still working on that farm to this day beyond the scope of her residency. And that farm provides an opportunity for the men who come through Sunday Breakfast Rescue Mission to work in the garden, and it also provides fresh food for their kitchen. And so to see this type of multi-year commitment is really incredible. And I think that leads to a challenge that we face in the nonprofit world, but definitely when we're looking at these deep community engaged projects, is that it's important for us and our relationships with community partners to make that type of multi-year commitment. And at the same time, it's obviously a challenge from the funding side to, I think, make the case for the value of a sustained project over the course of several years, rather than, coming up with a new project every year or every grant cycle. So that's something that I think is endemic to being part of a nonprofit institution, but we also see it when it comes to our community engaged work.
I think for 30, here's the question. It was the one about, for 33 years, the NPN has made community engagement a pillar of its residency support. Has NPN impacted your ongoing community engagement practices, or is it in conversation, I think is even a fair question here.
Yeah, I think what NPN has empowered us to do is to engage artists who have highly creative community practices. And so, for example, this past spring, we commissioned Byron Ao-Young to work on a project titled Activist Songbook. And so part of his NPN residency, the community engagement component, was coming to Philadelphia several times, conducting interviews with local activists, and also conducting workshops with local musicians and actors in order to generate a final presentation. And so, in a traditional mode, usually an audience engagement with a piece is that final presented piece. But with the support that we're able to receive from NPN, and I think NPN's focus on community engagement, we're able to see audience engagement with a piece when it's in development and over a larger span of time.
Going forward, how might the NPN deepen its support to community engagement to the benefit of its mission? Do you have some recommendations or thoughts?
I don't know that I'm familiar enough with NPN.
That's fine.
To do that, yeah.
To be honest, your answers have all been wonderful.
Okay. I'm like, nothing, you're doing great.
We're opening a space for that critique, because I think some will have that thought too. Given sort of the nature of what we're talking to, everybody doesn't have to answer it.
Because I think some of the funding challenges that I spoke about, I see that as a larger structural issue. I don't necessarily see that as an issue with NPN per se, right?
Although
it's like a shift that just generally needs to happen.
But, can an intermediary like NPN be thinking about long-term commitments too? Can it extend it? Is what you're sort of,
Right, or I think what I appreciate, and for me, honestly, what is kind of shocking about NPN is the fact that NPN recognizes the space for R&D, for the development of the piece. And, there's a separate expectation from engaging the artist, right, to separate from supporting an artist, to just have that space to develop a piece. And I think oftentimes grant cycles don't take that into account. And for me, I think community engaged work works best when there is that development period. And I think if that would be an adjustment that I would like to make in terms of how we look at community engaged work. And I think that's something that NPN has probably started thinking about with separating the presenting and the developing periods, and that it could advocate more about. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
So here's my arc. I think we're good.
All right.
And this was really helpful. You can stop tape at this point.